hiding like ghosts, skillfully slipping through enemy surface-to-air missiles. 3 fighters, 3 silent killers, are executing an extremely dangerous mission: to destroy BUSHEHR Airport Airbase, Iran. The order to fire has been given. In just 3 minutes, everything will be submerged in fire. But the real challenge is only just beginning. Surface-to-air missiles have locked onto the target, and the flight has only 30 seconds to decide their fate. Will they successfully escape death? At exactly 14:17 local time, at BUSHEHR Airport Airbase, Iran, 3 F-4E Phantom II aircraft of the 61st Tactical Squadron rolled one by one into the southern shelter area. The engines had just shut down. The metal skin was still hot after a flight lasting more than an hour. They had just completed a patrol and quick strike mission against surface targets in the Strait of Hormuz, where commercial ships and escort vessels move densely. The technical crews quickly approached, performed a preliminary check, then guided each aircraft into parking position. All procedures were carried out exactly to standard, fast, precise, but they did not realize that at the very moment the last aircraft had just stopped, a long-range strike had already been activated. From a distance of more than 125 miles, a formation of 3 F-15E Strike Eagles was rushing across the sky at an altitude of about 30,000 feet. Each aircraft carried 2 GBU-31 JDAMs, totaling 6 precision-guided bombs, each containing about 950 pounds of high explosive, enough to penetrate the concrete layer of the shelter and detonate inside. Only a few precise impact points. This place would no longer be an airbase, but a graveyard of the aircraft that had just landed. Throughout the entire approach, the 3 F-15E Strike Eagles maintained absolute radio silence, entering a flight corridor that had been calculated in advance. The aircraft completely shut off radar and all emission systems, using only inertial navigation to maintain a stable flight path. When still about 50 miles from BUSHEHR Airport, the lead pilot nudged the throttle twice, an internal signal that had been trained in advance to ensure formation synchronization in conditions without radio communication, avoiding all electronic emissions that could be detected by the enemy. Immediately, the 2 aircraft behind understood, tightened the formation. All 3 descended to only about 160 to 200 feet, hugging the surface to avoid Iranian coastal early warning radars. The formation maintained this extremely low altitude throughout the final approach segment, keeping stable speed and not creating any sudden changes. The only sign showing their presence, if any, would just be brief, flickering interference traces on radar screens, not clear enough to form a complete target. This mission did not allow any error because only a small deviation could push the entire formation into the air defense fire zone. At high cruise speed, the large mass of the aircraft did not reduce penetration capability. The 2 jet engines maintained stable thrust, helping the formation keep exact speed and altitude down to each second. External fuel tanks and payload configuration allowed them to fly continuously for hundreds of miles without refueling, shortening approach time and minimizing the possibility of being detected. Inside the cockpit, all information about terrain, threats, and targets was displayed directly on the front screens. The pilot did not need to take eyes off the flight path. Everything was updated continuously, enough to maintain situational awareness without emitting any signal. But only a few minutes later, when still about 37 miles from the Iranian coastline, the formation first received radar warning signals. At first were short pulses, then intermittent scans, then denser. The lead pilot confirmed that enemy radar had been activated. The displayed signals showed coastal radar stations scanning exactly along the formation's approach direction. The pilot did not change direction, but decided to keep formation, while slightly lowering altitude further to fall deeper into coastal radar shadow zones. Only a few seconds later, a second signal appeared, this time a wider scan type, lasting longer, showing another radar layer had just been activated. The display showed a multi-layer surveillance network forming around BUSHEHR Airport. That meant they had entered the core air defense zone. Inside the cockpit, the pilot did not activate active jamming, but kept all systems in passive mode. Signature reduction measures were maintained, combined with a stable flight path, making enemy radar unable to determine the real position of the target. From the ground, radar crews only saw weak reflections, appearing then disappearing, not clear enough to lock. The two aircraft behind kept proper separation distance, avoiding forming a large signal cluster on the screen. The separated reflections were processed by the system as environmental noise or false signals, not sufficient to trigger firing procedures. The signals weakened and then disappeared, showing that the enemy had just lost the only opportunity to protect their fighters worth tens of millions of dollars. When still less than 25 miles from BUSHEHR Airport, the formation began to increase altitude. They had reached the final edge of the pre-calculated safe corridor. Ahead was the target area, where radar and air defense systems could react at any time. The three F-15E aircraft split into two slightly offset approach directions, creating different attack angles to ensure that if one direction was detected, the other still kept trajectory. This was a standard maneuver in the final phase to reduce risk and increase probability of hitting the target. Inside the cockpit, everything was ready, and from this moment, the strike could not be stopped. When the distance dropped below 19 miles, the entire target at BUSHEHR Airport began to appear clearly on the display inside the cockpit. The three southern shelters, where the three F-4E aircraft had just been moved in less than a few minutes earlier, were clearly marked according to pre-programmed coordinates. In addition, two other aircraft were still outside, not yet moved into shelter. The previous reconnaissance imagery completely matched the current data. That meant there was no error. The pilot did not need to adjust much. Everything had been calculated in advance. At this stage, the only task was to maintain a stable flight path. The smallest deviation could cause the entire strike to miss the target. Below, the base still did not show any clear reaction. The flickering signals from earlier had completely disappeared from the radar screen. There was no target clear enough to activate a full system alert. The crews on duty continued operating according to normal procedures, and that was the fatal gap. Only 2 minutes later, when all parameters reached the optimal threshold, the lead pilot gently moved the control. This was the final signal that had been agreed in advance. Immediately, the order was executed. 6 GBU-31 JDAM bombs were released one by one from the pylons, separating from the aircraft along the pre-programmed trajectory. Each bomb weighed about 2,000 pounds, in which the penetrating warhead contained about 530 to 550 pounds of high explosive, enough to penetrate the thick concrete layer before detonating inside. As soon as they left the aircraft, the guidance fins deployed, and the inertial navigation system combined with GPS began to correct the flight path by fractions of a second. In the final dive phase, they accelerated very quickly, enough to turn each impact into a giant steel drill driving straight into the shelter roof before the entire explosive mass inside detonated. Only a few seconds later, the first bomb hit the target. A straight penetration from above, breaking the concrete layer of the shelter in an instant before detonating inside. The blast pressure was compressed within the confined space, then reflected outward through the penetration point. The entire shelter structure shook, then collapsed from the inside. Almost at the same time, the second and third bombs hit the remaining two shelters. There was no immediate wide explosion, but precise, piercing impacts, followed by internal detonation. The three F-4E fighters that had just been moved in less than a few minutes earlier were completely destroyed before they could react. The still hot fuel began to ignite, creating fires that spread quickly in the confined space. Immediately after that, the next two bombs dropped into the open parking area. In a place without protection and cover, the two remaining aircraft were hit directly one after another. The explosion occurred on the spot, tearing the aircraft fuselage apart and throwing debris outward. Flames burst violently, spreading along the remaining fuel in the wings and fuselage. The final bomb fell into the warehouse area between the two strike points, immediately creating an additional explosion that shook the entire southern section of the base. The shockwave spread, breaking glass, collapsing auxiliary structures, and blowing surrounding equipment apart. Within just a few seconds, the entire southern shelter area was completely collapsed. What remained was fire, smoke, and burning metal debris. In just an instant, BUSHEHR Airport flared up like a blazing torch in the night. Explosions erupted continuously, spreading rapidly like a domino effect, destroying each key point in the area. Immediately, when the entire bomb load left the pylons, the three F-15E aircraft did not maintain altitude for even a second. The pilot simultaneously pushed the controls, banking sharply to the south and beginning to lower altitude. The engine's increased thrust, speed was pushed up quickly to leave the target area in the shortest possible time. This was the most dangerous phase of the mission when the enemy finally began to react, and any error at this point was no longer allowed. Only a few seconds after the first explosions, the radar warning system inside the cockpit began to sound continuously. At first short, scattered pulses, then denser with each scan cycle. The lead pilot quickly confirmed. The fire control radars had been activated. This time, they were no longer at the edge of the scan zone, but inside direct tracking range. That meant the safe window had closed. The pilot did not change direction but kept the pre-calculated escape axis while rapidly lowering altitude below 330 feet. The objective was not to evade immediately, but to leave the target lock zone before the enemy completed the firing cycle. At this altitude, coastal terrain and the curvature of the Earth began to create small shadow zones. But they did not last long, and the smallest mistake could cause the entire formation to explode. Only a few seconds later, the warning signal moved to a higher level. A fire control radar had locked onto the target. It was no longer detection. This was the stage before firing. The lead pilot slightly banked to the right, a signal that had been trained in advance. Immediately, the two aircraft behind understood, preparing to maneuver in two different directions. The missile was launched. A bright flash appeared from the ground, followed by a smoke trail extending straight into the sky. In just a few seconds, it reached supersonic speed and rushed straight toward the lead aircraft. The distance between both sides decreased very quickly, almost not allowing any delayed reaction. This was the moment everything was decided in an instant. The pilot pulled hard to the right. Acceleration surged above 6G. The body was pressed tightly into the seat, vision narrowed, but the control remained precise. This maneuver was not to avoid immediately, but to completely change the radar seeker's approach angle. The missile needed time to correct its trajectory, and that gap was the only opportunity. The missile passed by, very close. Close enough that collision warnings sounded inside the cockpit, but it still missed. The F-15E remained intact, although the formation had been stretched away from the original position. The two aircraft behind immediately separated from the common flight axis, no longer maintaining formation, but diverging in two different directions. This was a standard maneuver to avoid being locked by multiple targets at the same time. Each aircraft became a separate signal, harder for radar to track continuously. The distance between the aircraft increased rapidly, and that significantly reduced the probability of being hit. Only a few seconds later, a new radar signal appeared from another direction. A second air defense system had been activated and joined the interception. The scan zones began to overlap, forming a denser target lock network. The pressure on the formation increased clearly, and reaction time continued to shorten. The second aircraft released flares. Bright, hot bursts spread behind, creating a wide interference zone in the sky. At the same time, the pilot pulled hard on the controls, executing a sharp maneuver to cut the approach angle. The target signal was fragmented and continuously shifted direction. This made it difficult for the missile seeker to maintain a stable lock. The second missile rushed in, faster, more stable, but this time it could no longer maintain a clear lock. Only a few seconds later, it lost the signal and exploded in mid-air. The three F-15E aircraft continued rushing south, maintaining extremely low altitude and high speed to leave the danger zone. There were no new commands. Everything was executed by trained reflex. This was no longer a strike mission, but a survival escape. Behind them, BUSHEHR Airport was still burning. Columns of fire rose high. Black smoke rolled and covered the entire southern area of the base. Secondary explosions continued to occur as fuel and ammunition were ignited. The entire area that had just been struck was no longer capable of operation, and no force had time to respond. On the radar screen, the target signals gradually weakened. The distance was now large enough, the speed was now high enough, and the target lock zone began to be left behind. The three F-15E aircraft left the area without being shot down. No losses, no deviation, and the final result had been decided from the moment the first bomb hit the target.